It began with a knock. Not the friendly kind you expect from a neighbor, not the casual tap of a delivery driver. This one was deliberate. Heavy. Cold. The kind of knock that tells you whoever's on the other side isn't here to exchange pleasantries. For Marcus, a hard-working black homeowner who had finally carved out a quiet corner of peace for himself, that knock carried a weight far heavier than would meeting metal. It echoed through his chest, whispering the same question he had asked himself too many times before. Why me? Why again? When he peered through the blinds, he didn't see uniforms he could trust. He didn't see city officers with badges. Instead, two men stood stiffly on his porch, puffed-up chests hidden behind cheap polos stitched with fake insignias. Their stance screamed authority, but their eyes betrayed something darker: control, intimidation, and the hunger to remind Marcus of his place. They claimed to represent the neighborhood association. But Marcus knew better. This wasn't about rules, lawns, or mailbox paint. It was about him. His skin. His presence. His very existence in a neighborhood some believed he didn't deserve. Still, Marcus hesitated. Years of experience had taught him the danger of assuming. The danger of speaking out too soon, too boldly. He could already feel the tension building, their fake badges glinting, their voices carrying that familiar tone he had heard all his life, the tone of men who thought they had the right to dominate him simply because of who he was. But what Marcus couldn't know, what those two men couldn't even imagine, was that someone else was home that day. Someone who had faced danger on battlefields far from suburban streets. Someone who had endured the weight of real authority, real combat, and real fear. Marcus's son, trained, disciplined, and forged into steel by the United States Navy SEALs, was about to step into the frame. And in that moment, the story shifted. The predators weren't hunting anymore. They were walking straight into a reckoning they didn't see coming. Because intimidation only works on those who feel powerless. And on this day, inside this home, power was about to be redefined. So the question is, what happens when men who wear false authority come face to face with someone who's lived under the truest authority of all? What happens when the game of intimidation is played on the wrong doorstep? Stay with me, because what unfolds next is not just a story about two men knocking on a door. It's about a confrontation that reveals the ugly roots of racism, the resilience of a father, and the unshakable resolve of a son who refuses to let intimidation win. Marcus Williams was a man who believed in the simple promise of hard work. He had spent years saving, budgeting, and denying himself luxuries to achieve the dream that so many chase but so few attain, owning a home in a neighborhood where his children could grow without fear. For Marcus, that home wasn't just brick and wood. It was proof that he had built something lasting, that he had broken through barriers set against him since birth. On most days, his life was quiet. He worked his 9 to 5, returned to evenings filled with family dinners, and found comfort in small routines. He took care of his lawn, waved politely to neighbors, and spent weekends fixing things around the house. Nothing about Marcus screamed confrontation or conflict. He had never sought the spotlight. He wanted peace, yet peace had a way of slipping through his fingers. Because no matter how perfect the lawn looked, no matter how new the shutters were, Marcus could not erase the shadow of suspicion that seemed to follow him. Some neighbors smiled with tight lips but looked twice when he walked by. Others avoided eye contact altogether. A few let their actions speak louder than words, cars slowing down when he checked his own mailbox, police cruisers idling a little longer near his driveway, whispers that stopped abruptly when he entered the grocery store aisle. Marcus had learned to swallow these moments. He told himself that progress was slow, that patience was a shield. He reminded himself of his children, of the future they deserved. Still, every time he felt those eyes on him, a quiet reminder stirred inside. No matter how hard you work, some people will only ever see the color of your skin. Yet, Marcus didn't live in bitterness. He had a strong sense of resilience, built over years of enduring slights, outright discrimination, and the constant need to prove himself twice over. What kept him grounded was his family, his pride and joy. His daughter was away at college, thriving despite her own battles with prejudice. And his son, David, had chosen a path that demanded courage few could muster, the United States Navy SEALs. David's choice filled Marcus with equal parts fear and pride. Fear, because he knew the dangers his son faced on foreign soil. Pride, because in David, he saw the embodiment of every lesson he had tried to teach: discipline, dignity, and strength that didn't need to shout to be heard. Life inside the Williams home was, in many ways, ordinary. Sunday mornings meant church, afternoons were for football games on TV, and evenings often ended with laughter echoing through the living room. But ordinary was fragile. Marcus knew this better than most. Racism had a way of shattering calm without warning, turning normal days into battlefields. It was during one of these seemingly ordinary afternoons that the foundation of his peace would be tested. Marcus was home alone, going about the kind of chores that filled his weekends, tightening a leaky faucet, sweeping the porch, humming quietly to himself. He noticed nothing unusual at first. The street was still, the air heavy with summer heat. Children's bikes leaned carelessly against driveways. Lawns shimmered under sprinklers. But beneath the quiet, something was stirring. A storm was forming, unseen and uninvited, and it was headed straight for his front door. Looking back, Marcus would realize how subtle the signs were, the lingering stares from certain neighbors in recent weeks, the pointed comments about keeping the neighborhood standards high. The flyers slipped anonymously into his mailbox reminding residents about rules that were never enforced on anyone else. He had brushed them off, convincing himself that ignoring small slights would prevent bigger ones. He had chosen not to make noise, not to give anyone an excuse to call him angry or difficult. But prejudice doesn't vanish because it's ignored. It festers. It looks for opportunity. And on that day, opportunity knocked, literally. Two men, strangers to Marcus but not to his neighbors, approached his home. They carried themselves with the swagger of authority, though nothing about them was official. Their clothes were casual but coordinated, their badges cheap imitations, their expressions rehearsed in the mirror of superiority. They didn't come with questions. They came with conclusions, with judgment already formed. Inside, Marcus had no idea what was waiting. He was still in the comfort of his routine, still believing the worst of the day had been the leaky faucet that wouldn't stop dripping. He didn't yet know that a line was about to be drawn across his porch, a line between intimidation and resistance, between silence and defiance. And what those men couldn't possibly predict was that Marcus was not alone. His son, David, had returned from deployment only days before. Quiet, disciplined, and carrying the weight of battles few civilians could imagine, David was adjusting back to civilian life. To him, the suburbs were supposed to be a reprieve, a place where danger existed only on television screens. But danger doesn't always wear camouflage. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, in polo shirts and fake titles, in the arrogance of men who believe power is theirs to fabricate. The Williams family was about to face a test they hadn't asked for. A confrontation that would not only expose the ugly underbelly of racism in their own neighborhood but also reveal just how far father and son were willing to go to protect their dignity. The knock that shattered Marcus's afternoon was not just a sound, it was a signal. A warning that peace was fragile, that safety was conditional, and that the real battle for respect was not fought overseas, but right here, on American soil. And with that knock, the story began. The knock came again, louder this time, sharper, like a warning. Marcus froze in the living room, his hand still gripping the dish towel he had been using to dry his hands. His heart thudded in his chest. It wasn't the knock itself that unsettled him, it was the intent behind it. Whoever was outside wasn't there for a neighborly chat. He edged toward the window, careful not to be seen. Through the thin sliver of blinds, he caught sight of them, two men on his porch, standing with rigid confidence, their shoulders squared as if they owned the ground beneath their feet. They wore casual clothes, yet each had a badge clipped to his belt, gleaming in the afternoon sun. But even from a distance, Marcus knew, those badges weren't real. The edges were too shiny, the lettering wrong, the arrogance too forced. His stomach tightened. Fake or not, they had come to intimidate him. He could feel it in the way they scanned his property, their eyes flicking to the trimmed hedges, the spotless driveway, the flag fluttering on his porch, as though searching for flaws, reasons, excuses to justify their presence. Then came the voice. "Sir, we need to speak with you about your compliance with neighborhood standards." Marcus's throat went dry. He had heard variations of that line before, thinly veiled codes meant to remind him that he was different. That his very presence was a problem they couldn't solve with silence. Still, he opened the door, just a crack. "Can I help you?" His voice was steady, though his pulse raced. The taller man stepped forward, close enough that Marcus could see the counterfeit stitching on the patch sewn into his polo shirt. "We're with the association's enforcement division. We've received complaints. Your yard, your guests, your noise levels. We're here to make sure you're following the rules." Marcus blinked. His yard was immaculate. He rarely had visitors, and the only noise that ever escaped his home was the sound of his daughter's laughter on her last visit. This wasn't about rules. It never was. "This is harassment," Marcus said quietly, but the words felt heavy, dangerous, like striking a match near gasoline. The second man smirked. "Call it what you want. We're just doing our job. Maybe neighborhoods like this aren't the best fit for everyone. The words landed like a punch. Not the best fit. The message couldn't have been clearer. Marcus felt heat rise in his chest. He had worked, sacrificed, and endured for this home. For this life. And now, two strangers stood on his porch, mocking his right to exist in the space he had earned. Behind him, a floorboard creaked. Marcus didn't have to turn to know who it was. His son, David, had entered the hallway, drawn by the voices. David's presence filled the room without a word. Broad-shouldered, disciplined, carrying himself with the calm of someone who had faced far worse than this, he stepped forward until he stood just behind his father. His expression was unreadable, his silence louder than any outburst could have been. The taller man glanced past Marcus, catching sight of David, and his smirk faltered. Something in David's eyes, cold, unwavering, trained, sent a ripple of unease across the porch. Still, he covered it with arrogance. "And you are?" David didn't answer. He didn't need to. His posture spoke for him, steady and unflinching. The air thickened. Marcus could feel it pressing against his skin, the weight of history and hatred compacted into this single moment. He wanted to believe these men would leave if he stood his ground, but experience told him otherwise. Men like this didn't back down. They pushed, and pushed harder, until something snapped. And that's when the accusations began. "We've had reports," the shorter one said. "Cars parked too long in front of your house. Strangers walking through the neighborhood late at night. People don't feel safe." Marcus's jaw tightened. He had heard these scripts before. People don't feel safe was never about cars or strangers. It was about skin color. About the assumption that his presence automatically meant danger. David finally spoke, his voice low and even. "Do you have identification? Any documentation from the HOA?" The question cut like a blade. The two men shifted uneasily. They weren't expecting resistance, not from Marcus, and certainly not from his son. "We don't need to show you anything," the taller one snapped. "We're here to enforce the rules. If you can't follow them, maybe you should consider relocating." Relocating. The word echoed like a gunshot in Marcus's mind. They weren't just questioning his compliance. They were questioning his right to live here at all. Marcus's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the rage clawing at his chest. He had endured slights, whispers, and quiet hostility for years. But this, men masquerading as authority, standing on his porch, demanding he justify his existence, this was a violation he couldn't ignore. And yet, he also knew the danger. Standing up could escalate. Silence could suffocate. Either choice carried risk. David stepped forward, his presence shielding his father like a wall. "You've made your point," he said. "Now leave." For the first time, the men hesitated. Their confidence cracked, just slightly, under David's unyielding stare. But arrogance dies hard. "Is that a threat?" the shorter one asked, his voice rising. David didn't flinch. "It's a statement." The porch seemed to shrink, the air thick with tension. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his ears, the line between safety and chaos razor thin. One wrong word, one wrong move, and this confrontation could spiral beyond control. And just as the taller man opened his mouth to respond, a voice called out from across the street. A neighbor, stepping onto their porch, eyes locked on the scene unfolding. Watching. Judging. Marcus's stomach sank. Because in that moment, he realized this wasn't just about the men on his porch. It was about everyone who had been waiting, watching silently, some even rooting, for a moment like this. The confrontation wasn't over. It was only beginning. The air on Marcus's porch had become suffocating, thick with tension and unspoken threats. The two fake officers squared their shoulders as if to prove they still had control, but the cracks in their confidence were beginning to show. David's silent, steady presence had unsettled them, though neither would admit it. The neighbor across the street lingered on their porch, arms folded, gaze sharp. Another blinds rustled 2 houses down. Eyes were watching, hungry for spectacle. To Marcus, it felt like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when a black man, and his son, refused to bow. The taller man stepped closer, invading Marcus's space. His voice dropped, low and venomous. "You people think you can move in, change the rules, make this place yours. That's not how it works." The words sliced through Marcus. "You people." He had heard them before, in classrooms, in workplaces, whispered behind his back or spat in his face. They carried centuries of weight, chains invisible but no less binding. And here they were again, on his own porch, flung like a weapon by a man who wore false authority as a shield. Before Marcus could respond, David moved. He stepped between his father and the man, his frame casting a shadow that swallowed the intruder's arrogance whole. David's voice, calm but edged with steel, cut through the stifling air. "This conversation is over." But the men didn't back down. Instead, the shorter one barked a laugh, cruel and sharp. "Or what? You'll fight us? You think your size means anything here? We can have the real police here in minutes, and who do you think they'll believe? 2 officers enforcing the rules, or you?" His eyes darted to Marcus, dripping with implication. "We both know how that story ends." Marcus's chest tightened. He had lived that fear, how quickly a call to the police could turn deadly, how the presumption of guilt always tilted against him. For a moment, hopelessness clawed at him, whispering that maybe silence was safer. Maybe endurance was survival. But David didn't waver. He leaned in slightly, his voice steady, unshakable. "You're not officers. You're trespassers. And if you want to test me," he paused, letting the silence stretch until even the air seemed to lean in, "you'll regret it." The words hit harder than any shout could have. They carried the weight of combat, of discipline forged in fire. For the first time, the 2 men faltered. Their eyes darted to each other, silently questioning whether they had pushed too far. And then, the sound of footsteps. More neighbors emerging, drawn by the rising voices. Phones lifted, cameras ready. The scene was no longer private intimidation, it was becoming public theater. Marcus's pulse raced. Part of him wanted to shrink, to disappear, to escape the spectacle. But another part, the part beaten down too many times, the part that had swallowed indignities for years, rose up inside him. He stepped forward, beside his son now, his voice trembling but loud enough for all to hear. "This is my home. I've earned it. I will not be driven out. Not today. Not ever." Gasps rippled from the onlookers. The taller man's face darkened, fury twisting his features. He jabbed a finger toward Marcus. "Watch yourself. This neighborhood doesn't want trouble. People like you." David cut him off, his voice sharp as a blade. "Enough." The porch seemed to vibrate with the force of that single word. The taller man opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult. And then David did something that shifted the balance completely. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled from his wallet a small, worn ID, his military identification card. He held it steady, the seal of the United States Navy catching the sunlight. "You want authority," he said, his tone low but carrying across the yard. "Here's authority. Real service. Real sacrifice. You walk around flashing fake badges, pretending to protect something you've never earned. But I've stood where men don't come back. I've carried brothers on my shoulders who gave their lives for a country that still doesn't see us as equal. And you dare to stand here, on my father's porch, and tell him he doesn't belong." The word struck like thunder. The crowd across the street shifted uncomfortably, murmurs rising. The shorter man's smirk had vanished, replaced by the twitch of someone realizing they were cornered. Even the taller one, still puffed with anger, took a half-step back. Marcus felt his throat tighten, not with fear this time, but with pride. For years, he had taught his children to hold their heads high, to fight with dignity, to survive in a world that tried to push them down. And now, here was his son, embodying every lesson, standing unflinching in the face of hate. But the men weren't finished. Cornered animals lash out, and so did they. "Military or not, you don't scare us," the taller one spat. "You're just another." He never finished. Because in that instant, the neighbor across the street raised their phone higher and shouted loud enough for everyone to hear, "It's all on camera." The words rang out like a gunshot. Suddenly, the balance of power shifted again. The men froze, realizing their intimidation was no longer shadowed. Every sneer, every slur, every lie, captured. Exposed. For a heartbeat, the entire street was silent. The only sound was the flutter of the flag above Marcus's porch. And then, slowly, the 2 men backed away. Their arrogance drained, replaced by something far more human, fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of consequence. But as they retreated down the walkway, one of them turned, his voice low, venom still lacing every syllable. "This isn't over." Marcus felt the words sink into his bones. A threat. A promise. A reminder that racism doesn't retreat quietly. David stepped closer to his father, his eyes never leaving the men as they disappeared down the street. The crowd of neighbors lingered, whispers rising, some sympathetic, others judgmental, all of them witnesses to a confrontation that had ripped away the polite mask of the neighborhood. Marcus exhaled slowly, his body trembling. The worst had passed, but the danger wasn't gone. Not really. Because the real battle wasn't just about two men with fake badges. It was about the deeper truth this moment had revealed, the fragility of belonging, the violence that simmered beneath the surface of everyday life. And as Marcus stood on his porch, his son beside him, he couldn't shake one chilling question. If hate could come knocking this boldly in daylight, what would it try next, under the cover of night? The men were gone, but the silence they left behind was louder than their threats. Marcus stood on his porch, the heat of the afternoon pressing against his skin, his chest still rising and falling with each shaky breath. His son, David, remained at his side, shoulders squared, eyes locked on the corner where the men had vanished. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. The confrontation had ended, but the wound it carved lingered. Neighbors slowly retreated, some slipping back into their homes with hushed conversations, others staring longer than necessary before closing their doors. A few left their phones lowered at their sides, unsure whether they had just witnessed justice served or trouble narrowly avoided. No one came forward to check on Marcus. No one asked if he was all right. In the quiet aftermath, the truth was clear. People had seen enough to be entertained, but not enough to be moved. Marcus exhaled, the weight of exhaustion settling on his shoulders. He wanted to believe it was over, that the men's retreat was the end of it. But he knew better. Racism never leaves quietly. It doesn't apologize when caught. It festers, retreats into shadows, and waits for the next chance to resurface. Inside the house, Marcus sank into his chair, head in his hands. He had worked his entire life for this home, this neighborhood, this dream of peace, and yet peace felt fragile, conditional. He thought of his younger self, told over and over that if he just worked hard enough, behaved properly enough, and kept his head down long enough, he could escape the grip of discrimination. But here it was again, pounding on his door in broad daylight, wearing fake badges and smug smiles. David sat across from him, silent for a while before finally speaking. "You don't have to carry this alone, Dad. You never did." The words struck deeper than Marcus expected. For so long, he had tried to shield his children from the worst of the world. He had carried the burden of quiet endurance so they wouldn't have to. But now, seeing his son stand against hatred with unflinching resolve, Marcus realized something profound. Survival was not the same as living. And silence was not the same as peace. The incident became more than a memory, it became a turning point. Marcus reported the men to the authorities, armed with the footage captured by neighbors. Whether justice would follow, he couldn't know. But he chose to act, not because he believed the system was perfect, but because he refused to remain silent any longer. And in the days that followed, Marcus noticed subtle shifts. A few neighbors began to greet him differently, hesitant smiles where there had once been avoidance, small acknowledgments that hadn't existed before. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was respect. Or maybe it was simply the realization that Marcus was not a man to be pushed aside quietly. But the deeper truth weighed heavier. For every confrontation caught on camera, countless more never see the light of day. For every moment when a Navy SEAL son could stand tall, there are fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters left vulnerable, unheard, and alone. Marcus's story wasn't unique. It was one thread in a much larger fabric, woven from centuries of systemic prejudice, everyday microaggressions, and the quiet exhaustion of people forced to justify their existence again and again. His confrontation on the porch was not just about fake cops or neighborhood disputes. It was about the way racism disguises itself, slips into everyday life, and demands that its victims prove themselves worthy of basic dignity. David reminded his father that day that strength doesn't only come from enduring, it comes from resisting. From standing up, even when silence feels safer. From refusing to let intimidation write the story. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. Because racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it knocks politely, smiling with false authority. Sometimes it hides behind rules, regulations, and concerns about safety. And sometimes, it waits for silence to give it power. Marcus's story forces us to ask, what would you do if hate came knocking on your door? Would you stay silent, hoping it passes by? Or would you stand tall, even knowing the risks, because silence only feeds the very thing that seeks to diminish you? The porch confrontation ended with two men walking away, but the larger battle, against injustice, against prejudice, against the quiet erosion of dignity, continues far beyond that street. Marcus and David's defiance was more than a moment of resistance. It was a declaration that intimidation would not win. And as you sit here, listening to this story, maybe the real question isn't what Marcus or David did. Maybe the real question is, what will you do the next time you see injustice? Will you look away, or will you stand, even in silence, beside those who are forced to fight? Because racism is not just their burden. It is a shadow we all must confront. So reflect on this story. Share it. Talk about it. Let it unsettle you, let it stir you, let it remind you that every knock on a door, every whispered slur, every unjust accusation is not isolated, it's part of something larger. And change only comes when enough people refuse to ignore it. Marcus's porch is just one of many. And tomorrow, it could be someone else's. So I'll leave you with this. If hate has the audacity to knock this boldly, don't we have the responsibility to answer louder?